Hello. And now that the dust has somewhat settled and each of you has had the chance to reflect on the theme from last week, the theme of Prometheus and archetypal fire, and now that we've had a chance to discuss it a little bit, I thought it would be a good opportunity to offer some sort of, not exactly concluding thoughts, but maybe synthesizing thoughts. And I've had the pleasure to and the privilege to read each of your reflections, and so I would like to just sort of carry some of the ideas that you introduced, just carry them forward in some way. And so I hope that in this video that I can succeed to some small degree. And now it might seem as though we've moved on now, and our current theme is artificial intelligence. It might seem like we're sort of returning to a theme that we left by the wayside, so to speak, by talking about the Prometheus myth again. And in some ways that's true, but in an important way it's not true. And if we think of artificial intelligence, really, in some ways it's the kind of the consummation of this process of the bestowal of fire, and then the human being's use of that fire, and one absolutely essential component of that use has been through with the medium of technology. In some ways, fire technology itself depends on the ability of human beings to harness this fire, and we can go into a little bit more of the meanings of fire, because it is such a rich and multivalent symbol. But whatever we mean by fire, it's somehow intimately related to the process of to the creation of technology, and the process of the development of that same technology, and then which process I'm suggesting has achieved some kind of pinnacle in the notion of artificial intelligence, and then even further intensified with the prospect of somehow simulated consciousness, right? That's in some ways that's the apotheosis of technology, of mechanism. And so in some ways these themes are it's the same theme in some way from a different side, almost like our beloved elephant. And then that being said, all of these ideas somehow relate to one another and interpenetrate. And in fact, as we go into a little bit more about myth, just at myth as such, a little bit later in these thoughts, I would like to suggest that the same way that ideas and themes and concepts, they're not separated and isolated and particularized in the way that objects in physical space are. Think of physical space, everything is outside of everything else in some respect. Exactly the reverse of that is true in what we could call intellectual space or ideational space. Everything interpenetrates, and every idea mutually supports all of the ideas around it, and is also supported by those same ideas. And it's no accident that this was in some ways before Newton came with the idea of universal gravitation. This was the way that the planets and the stars were conceived of. It's that they weren't falling continually. It's rather each sphere supported all of the other spheres. And then again, it's no accident that the planets were named after these same gods that we will be encountering, that we have encountered just in our brief excursion through one of these myths. Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto. These are all crucial figures in the corpus of Greek and Greco-Roman mythology. And then we named the planets after them, because the same ideas in some way hold amongst the gods. It's not as though they're exactly, well, the way in which all the gods are continually either at strife or relations or pairing or adversity and deeds and sufferings of all the gods. They're not static objects. They're active and they're productive too. They're not products. They're producers of what we encounter in the world. That's I'll hope to develop. That distinction between the products and the production or the producers of those products. I'll again delve into that a little bit later. I would though like to make a few more comments about the relation of fire and technology before we enter again into this sort of archetypal and mythic dimensions of fire. I would just like to draw our attention to the fact that that in some ways, in the most immediate way, fire itself, even if we just think of what the first thing that comes to our minds with fire, and more or less literal fire, and by literal I just mean the sort of most fundamental image of fire, which is associated with flames. We can think of ancient people around a hearth, that sort of fire, the ability to cook food, for example. Already, the ability to wield fire begins to, it gives human beings, it confers a certain power to human beings, but at the same time, as it's conferring this power, and I think this is where we really see the parallel, if not the identity of fire and technology. It confers power to human beings who are able to wield this fire. At the same time, and this is the side of technology that we don't often notice, and I tried to point this out also in the video immediately prior to this one, I believe, talking about AI and technology. It's that we think that we're creating the technology and shaping the technology and forming the technology. But at the same time, that technology is also shaping us and sculpting us and working back upon us. The minute we're able to wield fire, we also become dependent on that same fire. It's a simultaneous process almost. You imagine that even something trivial like the fact that we can't survive out of doors, and obviously we need to be able to cook our food because we don't have the guts to digest raw food in the way that other creatures do, even chimpanzees, right? Human beings don't have that. And so even our physiology is it testifies to this fundamental nature of fire, which both confers greater power, but also greater dependence on that power. And in some ways, it's really come to a pitch at this very moment that we're having this conversation, because we think of something like the Corona crisis. It's very obviously providing us a moment to reflect on the degree to which we're sort of dependent on all these fruits of technology, that in some way we tend to take them for granted. This is kind of an invisible, something that easily becomes invisible to us. But something like the Corona crisis, when it forces us to pause, we can begin to recognize all these ways in which we have, in some respects, outsourced what were before sort of innate and less actual capacities, but nevertheless sort of innate or intrinsic to us. We've technology in some way the archetype of technology in some way the archetype of technology has something to do with human beings casting off capacities and the artifacts of technology and the fruits of technology are somehow, they're like manifestations or images of capacities that were potential inside of us. That might sound quite abstract, but there's so many, as a theory, it can reveal, there's so many instances of it, that it can reveal so many cases. And one, for example, writing. This is an ability for us to, writing is again, a very original and almost archetypal technology. And we can see it's an externalization or an outsourcing of something that used to be more contained within our psyches or our minds. And this is, again, we gain some kind of immense power through writing, in the same way as all of these manifestations of fire. They become more effective once they're outsourced and once they become something technological. And they condition us to become dependent upon them. Writing, for example, it's so keenly felt by me. Doing these videos, for example, I'm very used to being able to not have to think on my feet, so to speak, and be able to write things down and then sort of forget about them and go on to the next thing. But in these videos, somehow, I have to be much more, I have to have everything contained, not exactly contained, but immediately available to me, so I can sort of on display before me, so I can move from thought to thought, right? And I just think how how frail that I would be compared to somebody like Homer or Hesiod. And I choose these names because they are famous bards from ancient Greece, and many of the myths, like the myth of Prometheus. Many of these myths are, we know of these stories in virtue of the tales that these bards told. But these bards didn't. They were not writing. They were not writers. They were the ancient Greeks, like all of the cultures, all ancient cultures. They were oral cultures, and I spoke about this a little bit in an earlier video, the earlier one about Prometheus, I believe, and I can put the links in the in notes on this video to those. I believe it was number 7, video number 7. But just the image of a bard before writing, before you could just look up these, go to a library and find a book of an anthology of Greek myth, or before you could look it up on Google, right? You would gather around a bard as a community, and you would watch the bard become inspired, and in fact invoke the muse for inspiration, and then from his mouth, through his breath, would pour forth these archetypal cosmic images and stories, and you listen to those stories, and you see them coming out from the bard. He's animated by this power, right? That's so different now. Again, it's even for me to do these small videos, it's quite a challenge, because I'm so conditioned to just dependent on being able to look things up and not have to, again, have them all there for before me, so to speak. And so I say that as a concrete and specific example of what I think is an essential or archetypal dimension of technology as such, which it both gives us new abilities or actualizes new abilities, while at the same time conditioning us to depend upon those abilities, right? And so I think it will be clear also as we further explore this week's theme, artificial intelligence. I think, again, that same principle that I just attempted to introduce, I think it will stand before us in sharp relief with the current theme. And so this is all by way sort of to show how the themes, they might be different, but they're certainly not exclusive. And in some ways they're quite the contrary. They're almost the same theme from different sides. And then also just going back to the sort of original impulse of a course like critical thinking. From the very first day, we thought of Socrates as in some ways the original, or the image of the perfect image of a critical thinker. And Socrates is so famous for his notion of his wisdom comes from wondering about things. His wisdom comes from being the one who knows how little he knows, and for that reason he's always inquiring and seeking to learn more. And Socrates' notion of the examined life being the only life worth living. And so again, anytime we can inquire further into any theme, we're doing so in the spirit of Socrates, in the spirit of critical thinking. And so in so many ways, rather than being a sort of a throwback or an exception, this is absolutely relevant to be in some way revisiting all of these themes that we've already covered, and trying to hold them all together with us, and everything that we learn, every time we struggle with one of these themes and struggle to comprehend it, this also changes us, and it gives us new ways of asking questions and new ways of inquiring. And then we can bring those new ways of inquiring, we can bring them to bear on old themes that we thought we left by the wayside, and they will reveal entirely new dimensions that before they would have escaped us, not because they weren't implicit there, but it's because we didn't know how to look for them, right? And so it's just like picking up an old book that you read years ago, and you read it again, and the print hasn't changed, but the book has changed in some fundamental way. And it's really because the reader of that book has changed. And so the more we struggle with these ideas, the more they also change us, and they help us to develop, and ultimately we're the ones that are then attempting to understand these things and inquire into them. And so in some ways that is a useful segue into the notion of fire itself as a symbol or an archetype. The notion of being changed and being sculpted and being formed. Each of you had your own sort of takes and insights into the meaning of fire. When we say fire, what does that term mean, right? And so there was a pleasing diversity and plurality of viewpoints that you took, but there were some certain commonalities. Like no one said fire represents something unimportant or trivial. It's rather it's exactly the opposite. There's something immediate about fire, and we say even fire is burning. We use that word to mean something that cannot be ignored. It's somehow pressing on us, right? It's burning, and then another aspect of fire was the notion of sort of transformation, right? And we have the first picture of fire that comes to us is a flame, and this itself is so expressive if we can read the expression, because the flame is it's a sign that the wood is being transformed. It's being in some ways reduced to ash, but also in some ways sublimated to light, right? And so it's like two things. Almost you can imagine, as a picture, we can imagine fire as heat or warmth, and then we see, and then we can picture the material world as somehow everywhere enchanted fire. And by enchanted I mean it's sort of hidden or frozen or bound up in covalent bonds or chemistry, right? Carbon bonds. And in some way, when we set a fire process, there's a continual fire process of transformation we call time, right? And time runs at a certain certain rate of transformation. But then we also see that fire is some kind of extreme intensification of that ordinary process of change, which we call time. And a flame is an immediate sign of that this process has somehow concentrated itself and become intensive. And so what we see as somehow ordinary kind of enchantment of heat or warmth into matter, and then its gradual disintegration and liberation, we see that intensified in fire, and it's liberated at once. Right? And this is kind of a transformation between transmutation of potential energy to kinetic energy in some way, and the warmth is released, right? And again, the fire, the meaning of fire in some way, it's meant to capture that real burning intensification of this process, right? And we can think further of fire in the sense of a flame itself being some kind of this process of change. It becomes so intensified that it's perceptible to our senses. It's manifest right in front of us as a flame. Yeah, and then again we can take this further, and all of these ideas are related, and it's kind of exciting because if we think about technology itself, in some ways technology is very clearly dependent on actual fire, just for example to smelt iron out of the earth and then cast the iron, starting from the most original tools, and this process has only become more sophisticated and more broadly applied. But then it's also, we see that the only purpose of technology, really, the only thing that it's used for, is to increase efficiency. Technology as such, it doesn't really add value to our lives unless they already have some value there, and then it allows us to realize that value in more efficient ways, right? But technology itself, it's only for efficiency, right? And this is why it's in some ways, it's clearly, this is also depicted in the myth and depicted in fire as such. It's clearly, it can be dangerous, right? So it can make good intentions more. You can realize good intentions more efficiently, just as you can realize wicked intentions more efficiently by the same technology. And fire is very similar in that respect. But if we see technology, though, as again sort of it's a way to make things happen faster, then immediately this can fit into our theory of fire, in the sense that we talked about fire as the process of transformation, the process of change, and then we see everywhere technology doing that at an increasing rate, and so technology too then is in some ways an immediate arm of fire as such, as a basic symbol of that entire archetype, and there are many, but technology and fire are in some ways intimately related, if not two faces of the same thing. And now if we sort of try to incorporate the mythic background of fire, this has sort of been fire as we experience it in ordinary life, sort of, but then trying to explore more deeply into the meaning of fire. We can also though try to incorporate into our critical thinking about fire. We can try to incorporate the mythic dimension of fire, and that was presented to us in the myth of Prometheus, who was the god, the titan, responsible for bestowing technology on, or conferring technology to human beings as a gift, right? And then we also saw that and many of you actually questioned this, or it was confusing. Why were the gods unhappy that fire? What is the meaning of the fact that the most of the gods were resented that fire had been given to human beings? And in an earlier video too, we thought of fire as, again, this process of change or transformation, and we thought of, again, there's a sort of natural fire, and we think of that as all of the fires that we've mentioned, just heat in general, which is again a process of transformation. Heat is, in some ways, that's the definition that physics gives to heat. It's kinetic energy and movement of particles. But then we also see, we also can think of fire in our own blood, right, in our metabolism, in this process of transformation. And fire, again, it makes those processes go faster. And in some ways, it's a process. It's two things at the same time. It's both destruction, but also generation from that destruction, right? And that's what we mean by metabolism. It's like catabolism and anabolism, but they're the sort of balance between those two. So breaking down and also building up. And then we thought of Prometheus somehow stealing the fire from its ordinary natural locale and domain, and giving it to human hands, and so that then humans can begin to and this follows immediately, to sculpt the earth and through technology, right? And then most of the gods were unhappy with this arrangement, and I think to make sense of this, we really have to consider what is being shown to us in a myth, and also why are we telling the Prometheus myth today, thousands of years after it was first told? That question might seem irrelevant, but it becomes much more pressing if we consider how many myths from thousands of years ago have been entirely forgotten. Why do we remember some of them? And what I would like to suggest is that we remember the myths. The memorable myths are the ones that most truthfully, or most with the most fidelity, the most accuracy, they're able to depict. So give a picture, give an image to invisible things. They turn. They make invisible processes into something visible that we can picture. This might sound quite abstract, but it's actually something that will be familiar to us. And if we think of Plato's parable of the cave, or the blind man and the elephant, these are in some ways, if not myths, they're at least pseudo myths, and we can see how useful they have been to us over this course. But then we can always ask the question, like, what are they? Why are they useful? Why are they easy to remember? Why are they still with us? And they're depicting things: a blind man, an elephant, and then a cave. And we can pose this question and say, where are those things? Where are those things that they are depicting? Do we think of Plato's cave as somewhere outside of Athens, for example? Do we think of the elephant as somewhere in India or Persia? Or is that maybe thinking of the question in the wrong way? And I would really suggest that what those myths are depicting are somehow processes of our own. They're depicting processes of our own minds and our own intelligences and our own cognition, but we immediately recognize their likeness in those myths because we're engaging in them all the time. But in some ways they're so close to us that we don't see them. But we recognize them when they are presented to us and when we confront them from the outside, so to speak. and that's one kind of myth, so to speak. And we wouldn't call that a myth. We would call that, again, a parable. Often myths have something they're analogous, but they often myths have less to do with these inner processes. Sometimes they do, but they're also one important function that differentiates the myths from something like a parable is that the myths are often depicting cosmic and cosmological processes. So in the same way that the blind man and the elephant, it's a kind of heuristic or a picture that helps us conceptualize and helps us visualize cognitive or mental processes. The myths, and especially the ones that we remember, they are somehow giving form or giving image to a cosmological and processes of creation, right? And so I'll try to explain what I mean by that. We are just sort of born, and there's a world around us, and we call it a world, or we think of it as a cosmos, because it has a certain it's ordered and it's structured and it's intelligible, and we're able to make sense of it enough to navigate around. And in Greek terms, this is what we can make sense of, and what is ordered in that way is called a cosmos. And this is contrasted to what is totally unintelligible, and this is called chaos, right? And so in some ways, the myths, and this is literally in the cosmological and cosmogony myths, they are depicting, they talk about the original chaos, and then the theogony of gods from that chaos and generations, and then we encounter Prometheus and Saturn and Zeus, Jupiter, several generations down the line. But they're the gods then, in a very analogous way to the way that the blind man and the elephant are giving form to invisible processes, that are, and those same cognitive and mental processes, those are in some ways productive of the products that we ordinarily are making use of, and I'm thinking of the thoughts that we have, and the conclusions that we have, and the beliefs that we have, and the convictions that we have. Well, those are all they're like fruits, but the production of those fruits came from something analogous to, or came from a cognitive or a mental process that those stories, the parable of the cave and the blind man, for instance, are attempting to give image to. Similarly, we can think of the myths. If we look around at the world and nature, for example, the world is structured, and it follows certain orders and regular patterns, and we can think of the gods as somehow personifications of those patterns or those paradigms. It's much more common to think of natural laws today, right? But this is in some ways it's more helpful, but in some ways it's distracting and it's misleading, because we will be tempted to think of the laws as something abstract and something impersonal, something that almost like something in the way we think of the laws of physics. We often think of them as kind of consistent and unviolated through time, right? For the Greeks, or any, if we think instead in terms of gods instead of natural laws, rather than say that one is better than the other, what we should say is they each encourage as different theoretical frameworks, so different meta theories or paradigms. They will reveal different sides of the world to us, right? And this might sound this might sound like I'm hedging the answer, but this is how it is. That it's not. So even in physics, there are often conflicting theories that both are able to accurately describe observations, right? And it's not clear which one is true, and that might even be the wrong question to answer. And instead, we can say, what does each one help us to see, allow us to see? What does each theory provide the conditions to see? And forgive me if that's confusing. We can, in the week after this one, we will have a we will briefly consider and explore the process of scientific reasoning and scientific method, and I hope that can clarify a little bit of that question. But so returning to the myths, we can think of those myths as, again, in some way, depicting invisible processes that are responsible for the products that we see in the manifest world, right? And so, again, in a way that's analogous to the way that the blind man and the elephant, for example, depicts an invisible cognitive process that is responsible for the products that we ordinarily think of as thoughts or beliefs or ideas, and so then one thing that the gods, thinking of picturing gods behind creation instead of natural laws, is that then we see how it's not clear that a law by itself could be operative. Like, why does matter follow the laws? We know why people follow laws, more or less, but it's not obvious why. How do particles know which laws to follow, right? When we think of it as gods, it's much more sensible in some ways, much more believable, because then we will start to think of these forces as, in some way, possessing some kind of agency and intelligence, and they're responsible in some way for maintaining these patterns that propagate themselves, and that it's only because of these consistent patterns, the fact that they do maintain themselves and propagate themselves, it's only because of this that we do live in a world that is intelligible to us in important respects, right? And so then we think of the gods as, if we think of the gods as somehow responsible for creating and generating and maintaining what we often think of today as natural laws, but it's like maintaining the patterns according to which the world conducts itself and operates. Then we can then something can make sense, or we can establish a connection and say that in some way what the gods are responsible for, which is this kind of generation and maintaining and propagation of the patterns by which nature operates. We can see what happened when Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to, which was before it was the unique, it belonged to the gods alone. Now it's suddenly been given to human beings, and then suddenly human beings have a share in ministering this amazing transformative power that we think of as fire, and amazing like awesome and awful, right? That it can cause the process of transformation itself. It can be dangerous, right? And then we can see how human beings have, how it's true. Human beings have really begun to shape nature in ways that would have been impossible without basically a godlike ability to harness and shape and sculpt and mold the structures of the world and of nature, of the earth itself, right? And again, I think we're confronted with a situation right now that is encouraging distinct and concentrated reflection on on whether we've made good use of this godlike ability that has been bestowed on us. And then it might be, well, so just to finish a thought, that might be a way to understand why some of the gods would have been unhappy. Right? There's a kind of natural equilibrium that the gods are keeping, and then it's clear that in some ways that equilibrium has been upset. Well, I will conclude this video, and I hope again it was much less than trying to offer any sort of conclusions or close any books. I am hoping more than anything to have stimulated further thoughts and further questions, and I hope this can also inspire further discussions for all of us. And so, on that note, I will close the video, but not before wishing each of you the very best, and until next time.